I don't know if you're familiar with the story of Samuel's mother, Hannah, but she poured out her soul before God, praying for a child. Eli was the priest. He thought she was drunk, and then he realized what an honest person praying looked like. God granted Hannah just what she needed, the birth of her son Samuel. And then Hannah gives Samuel back to God. "O my Lord, as you live, I am the woman who was standing here in your presence praying to the Lord. For this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted me the petition I made to him. Therefore I have lent him to the Lord, and as long as he lives, he is given to the Lord." Friends, there is faithfulness and there is faithfulness. When we think about giving back to God the thing we wanted most in our hearts and that we can't imagine doing without, relinquishing our own child back to God, it is a perfect trust born of pain and hope and love. And I've wondered if Hannah would have made the same decision to leave Samuel with Eli if she'd known about Eli's sons. He wasn't really dad of the year. Maybe she did know about them because his sons were horrible people. People complained about Eli's sons and their behavior. They stole the offerings. They showed no respect for the office of priest or to the people they were called to serve. They disrespected God. They disrespected God's people. They disrespected their father. And in the face of that human frailty and brokenness, the faith of Hannah and the persistence of Eli are really worth taking stock of. Samuel grows up in Shiloh with Eli and his deadbeat sons serving God. And we're told the word of the Lord was rare in those days and visions were not widespread. Don't rush past those opening words. Some days the miraculous stories of Scripture seem far from our lives and experience, but maybe this is one we can understand. Visions are few and far between. God's word may seem silent in a world filled with the sons of Eli barking at us online. And Samuel knew that. He was ministering to God even though the preacher's kids in his church were jerks. Even though visions were not widespread, even though he had never had his own personal encounter with God, there he was ministering to God. Sometimes faith is a clearly answered prayer or a visit from an angel. Sometimes faith, though, is going through the motions without a clear expectation that anything is going to happen. There is no indication Samuel was expecting that God would speak to him. We'd been told Samuel did not yet know the Lord, and the word of the Lord had not been revealed to him. When God first calls Samuel's name, Samuel doesn't ignore the voice. He just doesn't think it's God at the end of the line. So he goes to Eli, waking him up to ask what he needs. "I need to sleep without being woken up," is what I might have said the first couple of times he popped in saying, "Here I am." Eli wakes up enough to realize what's happening and sends Samuel back with an action plan. This morning in Bible study, actually, Dave Hurlburt had another idea, and that was maybe Eli knew exactly what was happening and didn't really want to hear the message. Maybe it took him a couple of times before he was like, uh-oh. God had already instructed Eli to expect judgment because of his inability to correct the wickedness of his sons. So Eli gives us a different view of faithfulness than Samuel's mother does. Her faithfulness is at the moment when everything goes well, after her beloved son is born. But Eli's faithfulness through the time that everything falls apart, after his beloved son's sin in the eyes of God. Eli never stops serving God, even as his sons descend into wickedness, even as he hears about God's judgment coming upon him and his family. Eli continues to minister to the people, continues to care for Samuel. And even though he is waiting for God's judgment to be announced, he still sends Samuel in to receive that message. Eli shows a deep faithfulness to his call in the midst of the train wreck that is his life. "Samuel, my son, what is it that he told you? Do not hide it from me." There is grace and courage in facing things straight on without apology or excuse. No matter your failings of the past, it is never too late to face the truth. And Eli responds to the bad news with, "It is the Lord. Let him do what seems good to him." As Eli's story ends in tragedy, Samuel's story rises out of its ashes. And we're told Samuel grows up and the Lord was with him and let none of his words fall to the ground. Isn't that beautiful? I'm really grateful for all of the words God has let fall to the ground that I have spoken, but none of Samuel's words fall to the ground. This story also has me thankful for the people who have helped me figure out that it was God's voice when I was hearing it in my life. Religious communities, churches, temples like at Shiloh, they are imperfect places filled with imperfect people, like Eli's sons, like us. And yet, while I understand why people leave organized religion these days, especially when American Christianity seems to have aligned itself so closely with one political agenda, I'm even more grateful to those of you who stick it out. Not because we figured it all out, but because God spoke to Samuel in the middle of just such a time and place. When we show up to worship in the middle of a long holiday weekend, and let's face it, there are plenty of other things we could be doing, we are putting ourselves intentionally in community. A messy, imperfect, loving, sacred community. And some days we get it right. Some days we're like Hannah, faithfully giving our very hearts and our very lives to God. Some days we're like Eli. We don't know how to clean up our messes, but we're here anyway. Some days we're like Samuel, serving God even when we've never heard God's voice and we have no idea what we're doing here. I think of the call of Samuel and the mess of faith community, and I think with gratitude of you and the other faith communities that have helped me hear God's call in my life. Because I have mostly heard God because of other people. When Justin and I were newly married and living in Albuquerque, I was working at an elementary school. I was considering applying to law school or, I don't know, maybe getting a teaching certification. I turned down acceptance to graduate school when I realized that a PhD in European social history was not what God wanted from me. A number of people in the church we worshiped at asked me if I was going to apply to be the youth director. And my response each time was some version of, and how do I say this politely, hell no. I was 24 years old. I had barely recovered from my own high school years. The idea of working with teenagers made me feel like I would again be a 14-year-old hot mess of myself walking into the lunchroom on the first day at a new school. Thank you very much, no. Additionally, I had just placed a child for adoption a few years earlier when I was in college. I did not feel like I was a role model for anybody else. So God sent more people to ask me if I was applying, and I continued to say no, even as I was actively trying to figure out what God had in mind for me to do with my life. And one night I had a dream. And I heard a loud, stern voice call out, "Marci, listen to me." I woke up in a cold sweat because I knew exactly whose voice I had just heard, and it terrified me, still does. The next day I applied for that youth position at the church. Okay, God, this is a really bad idea, but I'm going to do it. In the interview, the committee asked me a number of questions because I had, remember this, no experience. I had no discernible job skills for this position. God bless that committee. One of their questions, though, was, let's say one of the kids in your youth group comes to you and tells you she's pregnant. How would you counsel her? I told them that was the one question for which I knew the answer. And I told them my story, and I told them about how the church had helped me through it. And by the end of the interview, the entire committee was in tears. I was in tears, which is not my preferred way to interview for a job, or preach for that matter. They still offered me the job, and because of them, I found my calling and my career. Now, I don't know if I would have found my calling without the voices of other people. Now, I'd also like to say I've been quicker to hear God's call since that experience, but I have not. As many of you know, it wasn't until 10 different people told me there was a church seeking a pastor in San Francisco, and that call sounded like a good fit for me. 10 people that I finally looked into it and acknowledged that, yes, it did seem like a conversation worth exploring, and now here we are. Because sometimes the call comes when you're doubting your own giftedness, as it did for me when I was 24. But sometimes the call comes when you're busy enjoying the life you're leading, as it did when I was 50. So whether or not you think you've heard God's voice, I invite you to look back at your life and remember the voices of the people who were there at those critical junctures for you. How did their advice or their pushiness or their love or their encouragement or maybe their directness help you find your path? As I think about call, I have to think about community. Now, I'm not going to suggest there are limits to how God can speak to people, because God is God and I am not. God can speak through strangers, and I trust God can deliver the call even if you never leave your home. But my experience of God's call has always been lived out in community, by people who know me, which means they know the real me, the one who is sometimes a mess and sometimes delightful, and they have been able to tell me things that sometimes I did not think I wanted to hear. And so that is why I am thankful for church, for all the congregations I've been a part of through the years, and for you. Because God's call has always been that life-giving path I needed, even when I didn't know I needed it. I am thankful to be here with you, listening together for God's voice, and trusting that whatever God calls us to do, we can do it together. And when you look at the world around you, friends, God needs you to answer that call. The world needs to know of God's love when the people who speak for God claim that God is about exclusion. God needs you to answer the call, and there's a million different ways you can do it, and only you know what that is, with the help of other voices. So let's talk to each other, let's support each other, and let's answer the call. God is calling you.